evening, everyone, and welcome. Sorry a bit late, but hopefully you're used to that by now. When do I start? Bang on the dot. Never do. So, hopefully you're used to it, but this is bound to be an interesting stream. We have Benjamin with us again. I think actually for the third time you've been on the stream, I think, actually, possibly.
Well, you can't get rid of me.
So, first of all, hey Chris, hey Mark, hey Amy, hey Mark and Victoria, hey Leah. Yes, we go. Hey Steve, hey Steve, hey Greg,
hello, everybody.
Hey DK. And anyone else who's interested? Hey Mandy. Well, for anyone who hasn't seen the previous streams that you've been on, hey Jacob, do you want to give yourself another quick introduction into sort of who you are and what you do, and why we should be listening to you on these sort of subjects?
So I am a invertebrate vet. I'm an exotic vet, and I've spent probably the better part of 10 years. So ever since I was a second-year vet student, trying to develop our knowledge and understanding of tarantulas and parasites. So why you should listen to me? I would like to think I've got some understanding of veterinary medicine in parasites. I think there's an awful lot that I don't know and that we don't know collectively. So I think it is really important to ask questions and to challenge conventionally understood stuff that may have been established in the hobby. So I will try my best to answer the questions we have, but I'm not going to pretend that we know everything about these animals. We really don't. But yeah, I'm a vet that's really interested in invertebrates and tarantulas to the point of, I guess, the development since we've last done a stream has actually started a business essentially around developing research into invertebrates. So with a mind to really develop what we know and get practical treatments which can result in clinical resolutions and actual improvements. So rather than just stuffing a spider in an ICU and hoping for the best, my aim really is to get to a point where we can actually treat spiders, realize what's going on, and give people a realistic capacity to improve their outcomes beyond just hoping. Because it feels like there's a lot of hope rather than us really knowing what's going on. So you get me started, I can go for hours. So.
Yeah, you definitely. I can go there. You definitely hear a lot in various groups where something occurs, like sort of the recent sort of situation that we're going to talk about and stuff, where people either say, "Oh yeah, stick it in an ICU and hope for the best," or they just say, "I'll just freeze it and kill it, and there's no hope," sort of thing, rather than going, "Well, actually, let's look at this. Is there something that can be done?" And stuff. It's a great shame that there's still that kind of attitude out there, but hopefully. As the years go on, that will change, and we go, well, actually, these animals are our loved pets, and surely we should treat them as if we would, if a cat or a dog gets ill, surely we go to the vet. Why shouldn't we go to the vet with our tarantula if it gets ill?
Well, I guess we also have to remember that I think about 250 Parasitic species have been kept in captivity at one point or another. It's a quarter of all tarantula species. So actually there's a lot of conservation value to these animals, especially when you think about Pocolifera species.
Yeah.
Some of those animals are going extinct in the wild. It may
Absolutely.
well be that captive populations may be the potential Noah's Arks of trying to reintroduce these species 50 or 100 years down the line. So if we lose them because of disease that could be prevented, it just becomes very sad, beyond just the welfare implications.
Absolutely. Hey, Osmond, hey, Susan, hey, Gemma, hey, Craig. There's lots of people.
Hello, Erin.
Hey, Aaron. That's absolutely great, and I will be putting in your website into the chat for people to
Oh
do check
gosh,
out a lot
people
of
can
things.
judge.
And if the mods can also be sharing that as well, just throughout everything. So yeah, well, the reason that I said to join me, for a third time is in a recent show, or since a recent show, there's been a few reports of nematode infestations in a few tarantulas. There's also been videos that have gone up from other YouTube channels on forward fly sort of infestations. Another person who in Belgium, she's just been dealing with a nematode situation herself for about the past 3 or 4 months and stuff within her own collection and stuff. And this is obviously really, it's not the for me, it's not the first time that this has sort of happened within the UK hobby at all. But I think a lot of people are fairly new, new to it, and this is their first time that this has sort of sprung up. And there seems to be a lot of panic that sort of come about with this and stuff. So, what is it that we scientifically that we know about nematodes within tarantulas?
Well, I guess we know. So I guess the truth is we know that there are nematodes. We know the clade of the nematodes that has been associated with these cases in the past. Do we know exactly what species of nematode is involved in this most recent infestation that will probably be associated with a wild shipment of something? I don't actually know the details. Um, Several species of nematode have been associated with this sort of nematode presentation in tarantulas. Uh, there are other nematodes associated with true arachnids. So I guess the problem we make is we hear the word nematode and we assume that covers everything, that there's one nematode, or that we say it's got nematodes, that means that presentation is the same for all. And actually, you know, nematodes exist and other worms, to be honest, not just nematodes, roundworms, other worms are associated with invertebrates in the wild in lots of different species and lots of different arachnids. It's been reported, but actually the specific information about this specific nematode, we don't really know. Because those cases aren't really seeing researchers or vets, they're sort of kept in a hobby and then they die and then that's it. Um, we don't know that much about this particular nematode incident. In truth, if anyone's been in the hobby for any amount of time, you know, as I'm sure Phil will tell you, I'm sure people in the audience will remember that this is not the first time. This isn't even the 10th time. Every couple of years, you will have some. Essentially, nematodes come from three places. Uh, Either it's a wild caught spider that has been imported to a wild caught population of spiders, and they're stressed in the shipment over. Because when you think about it, you're stuffing a spider in an enclosure or in a small pot for who knows how long. And depending on the trader or the vendor or the person importing them in, they might stay in those pots, they may not be rehoused. That's incredibly stressful for that animal. And if it has a low level of perhaps commensal nematodes or perhaps commensal worms, or it's been exposed, it has that infestation occurring, then it's going to multiply in that animal because that animal is stressed and under strain. And then it comes to a show, and then it's bought. Sometimes not with a full exam, because you can't necessarily do a full exam and handle at a show for lots of different reasons. But you buy it in good faith, and perhaps the trader or the vendor hasn't even realised. Um, you know, and that's one presentation. The other source of nematodes, source number two, is an established infestation in that spider species. That spider species has become acclimatized to over many hundreds or thousands or tens or hundreds of thousands of years. So when we're thinking about parasites, and other organisms that are associated with, you know, a species, you're dealing with variations of normal. So some of these parasites for certain species may be very variation of normal. Now the problem we have is when you think about a ferrophotic collection, you are thinking about a mixture of lots of different geographical regions. You know, you mix your Mexicans, your South Americans, your Australians, your Asian spiders, your African spiders, they're all getting mixed in the same collection. So if you don't have sufficient hygiene between animals, or if you don't know that an animal's got an infestation, you may spread that infestation to a new spider from a different geographical region that isn't acclimatized, acclimated to that parasite, which is a reason why it sometimes turns up in captive populations because you've had a spider that uh, perhaps doesn't have those. You, know, you have a spider that's perhaps not showing the signs of that infestation, and it's not going to because that infestation is a variation of normal. But then you take that same parasite and you introduce it to a species that isn't used to that parasite, then you get a dramatic, or perhaps not so dramatic, because again, we're thinking about these things in vertebrate contexts. Your third source of parasites is wild animals. We like to pretend we live in these incredibly aseptic environments, but in truth, we have spiders and insects around us all the time. There are spiders everywhere. There's spiders in the wild, and they do interact with our captive spiders. Because I remember a case where it became a question mark as to whether the parasite had come from a false widow that was in a web over the tarantula enclosure. Now, I wasn't convinced by that, but it does show you the principle that it could be that some of these parasites are coming from native invertebrates because something that's acclimated to a native invertebrate
Yep.
may be able to overgrow in a sometimes immunosuppressed captive invertebrate. So roughly three different sources of parasites. So I've just lectured you. Probably lots of information very
No,
quickly.
no, no,
Is it
absolutely
making
fine.
sense?
It makes sense. Certainly makes sense to me. I'm sure it makes sense to everyone else. And guys, if you do have questions about this, do put it in chat. Obviously, about the sort of general sort of things. Because unfortunately, with this current one, I think what's happening this time is that obviously there's much more people on social media now and stuff, so it's easier to suddenly put pictures and people are then getting scared. They, again, a lot of newer people into the hobby and stuff, but where this time it's been like maybe 5 or so since the Bedford show, I think, something like that, and I think a lot of them have just been sent back to the supplier. And then we don't know what the supplier has done with them since then, whether they've seeked out any kind of veterinary help from someone or whatever. No one sort
I
of knows.
mean, if you are a vendor with any sensibility to you and you have a spider that has nematodes, actually so hopefully it's in quarantine. If it's in quarantine and it has nematodes, it should be euthanized because it's a risk to other spiders. And if you have 1,000 of them or 1,000,000 of them, you don't want to risk nematodes spreading to your other spiders. Um, I guess the thing is to remind people that, again, it's a vet that's saying this, so it sounds awful, but ultimately, if you pay for a product, whether it's alive or not, and it's not as advertised, you do have a legal protection. Because if you have a receipt of sale, it's no different to buying a microwave from Curry's. If you buy a microwave from Curry's and it's full of nematodes, I think it's reasonable to go back to Curry's and be like, well, can I have my money back, please? Because you've sold me a microwave full of nematodes. I know that sounds awful, but it is important to have that understanding that ultimately, if someone's sold you something that is not as advertised, it is okay to send it back. Um, you know, ultimately, it's not that person's. If you buy an animal that's sick, you have to make a decision as to whether you want to take responsibility for that veterinary care, or if you want to actually maybe pass that responsibility back to the person who sold it to you. But it's where it gets a bit.
Yeah,
I think you almost sound a bit heartless.
no, absolutely. No, it's also me just asks how long does it take for them to show up in the tarantulas? Now, I'm guessing that very much depends on a variety of different factors, probably.
So Moon, very interesting work name, Moon over in Miami. I love it. Depends on the nematode species, depends on the species of Ferrophosid, and it depends on the. I love it, Steve. Yes, you should always quarantine any new microbes you buy, but it
Deep
really
coverage
depends
rate.
on how stressed that tarantula is. So you've got to remember that if we're thinking about first group, wild tarantulas that have been imported from another country, they've probably been in those pots for a few weeks,
Mm.
possibly longer. Maybe you're lucky and they've been in there for a few days or for a week. But chances are, if they've been imported, you know, in their wild caught, which many of these animals are, they've been in wild caught en masse, probably in hundreds or thousands. They've been stuffed in pots, and then they have been imported over several weeks. And when you think about what that means for an animal, it means that animal is in a very tiny little space where they're constantly being reintroduced to their waste, essentially, which is why an animal in the wild may not exhibit clinical signs associated with nematodes, but that process of forming nematodes and being immunosuppressed will make it happen much more quickly. So typically, it's weeks, several weeks, 2 months. And normally what you're seeing is an animal slowly becoming symptomatic rather than the actual process of the parasite. So the parasite's probably been around for a few weeks already. So I definitely think some tarantulas, what the TM do, are asymptomatic because some of these parasites are variations of normal. Um, but it's weeks essentially. I think in terms of quarantine time, you've probably got to be thinking about 3 months. Uh, but yeah, it's weeks to months for some species, but there's probably a lot of variation. And there certainly are some presentations where it's days, where you get that animal, it's already stressed, and you start to see the clinical signs in days. And just to sort of clarify, whilst we're here, I'm going to throw lots of information at you guys, is the main clinical signs of nematodosis is this white discharge around the mouth. And what that white discharge is it is essentially the nematodes are causing damage to the esophagus and the sucking stomach. And there is some evidence that nematodes are actually more internal than that they actually spread around. And that white discolored fluid is actually bacteria. It's a bacterial soup that's feeding on the hemolymph, which is being lost due to that damage that's occurring to the nematodes. So it really depends on where we are in that life cycle, in that damage. Because if you're in a very, very end stage case, those nematodes may have done irreparable, massive harm to uh, to the actual esophagus, which itself is a chitinous structure, a cuticular structure, which is then molted. So resolving these spiders' clinical signs is sometimes really challenging in these end stage cases because you've got several dimensions going on. You've not just got the nematodes, you've also got the bacterial infection that will be associated with the infestation, and it really depends where you are and how that tarantula is responding. Because again, it's if you go into the research and the case reports, there are different presentations of nematodes because there are some which form a really, really, uh, really sort of chalky white, and there are others which form this really liquidy stuff. And it goes to show you that there's a lot of variations, there's a lot of species variation, and there's probably a lot of nematode variation because a lot of these, what we know, are maybe based on nematodes. So the most recent papers in the literature, in the veterinary literature at least, are done by Remy and Pizzi. That's 10, 20 years ago. To a lesser extent, I'm keen to get hold of some of these tarantulas because I've also seen tarantulas that have these nematode signs and they don't have nematodes because anything that causes damage to the esophagus can form this little white soup. So the other thing to bear in mind is that some of these animals that are presenting as nematode animals, unless actually someone actually does the tests and looks for nematodes in an oral wash, you don't know. So a lot of these animals, so this is why you're seeing some of these posts where you're actually seeing maggots, because it's not nematodes. It's essentially fly strike of tarantulas. So we've got this
Yep.
discussion of phorid flies are a
Yeah,
symptom related to
indicated stuff.
nematodes, or do they spread them? I think there's a bit of a chicken and egg situation here, really, because I think phorid flies are associated with nematodes. I don't know to what extent they're associated with that bacterial hemolymphy soup. Do they spread them? Possibly, because I think nematodes are often microscopic. So some
Mm.
of them are huge and big, but usually they're huge and big in their end of life stages. Actually, they're there, before they get to that size, they're much smaller and much more abundant. So they probably do get spread by forest flies. To what extent the forest flies are more related to the symptoms, that bacterial soup. Um, and they're probably also taking advantage of that weakened host because if you've got an animal that's weakened, because we fight off parasites all the time, our dogs and cats fight off parasites all the time. They exist in the environment. We do worm in our dogs and cats, but actually, this is this is something that you know animals deal with. So if an animal's succumbing to parasites, be it nematodes, be it aspirin white, you know, acarine mites, be it whatever, there's a reason for it. And often when we're thinking about managing these cases, we need to manage the reasons. So probably some of these species that are becoming more badly affected may well be because we don't fully understand. So I'm eating pizza. It may well be that it's because we don't understand the subtleties of keeping that animal in captivity. And actually, that's the reason why it's more susceptible compared to other species, even from the same geographical region. So you guys get me talking, I will talk for England.
Uh, that's what we like. I think it was soaking it up because with the forest flies, what a lot of people tend to say, or what I've been saying is that they perhaps get attracted to a, a pheromone that may be for the nematodes because they smell sort of sickly sweet and stuff because of that white gunk and using that they're attracted to that and then subsequently start passing them around. And it's hard to you can't really get away from forest flies because if we're keeping invertebrates, I tend to think we've probably got forest flies around the place somewhere. They come in like feeds all the time and stuff. So constantly getting the odd forest fly here and there. And most of the time, they don't really do too much. It's normally sometimes the conditions aren't quite right, but are really good for the fireflies that they'll perhaps take over. Sort of a non-nematode one. There was Dave's Little Beasties. Put a couple of videos of one of his ones which he doesn't think's got nematodes, and it's been in his private collection. It's been at somewhere else for a bit, but he found maggots on it and stuff. So he done a whole thing of pinch grab. I think it was a Singapore blue pinch grabbing it and trying to get off the maggots and stuff and cleaning it up and seeing what kind of happens from that. And it was like these are just looks like they're just external sort of thing. And then the second one it was a bit more lively kind of thing than it was
Mm.
beforehand. They put it in a drier environment rather than a really moist environment. So,
Well, yeah, a lot of this is, what would these tarantulas do in the wild? I think sometimes if they have a particularly bad um, infestation, they'll expose themselves to environmental conditions. Um, and yeah, I have seen that a lot, tarantula Rookie. I agree with you.
yeah.
Like, people are seeing like silverfish for whatever. But again, some of these issues are a little bit, how much do people really know about keeping a live habitat, or a what's the term for now? It's too late at night. The when people are keeping, oh, my brain is running. When people have a cleanup crew, my brain is
Bioactives and live planters.
bioactive. Thank you. I promise I'm a good vet, guys, even though I can't remember stuff. How well do people really understand bioactive setups? Because bioactive setups are incredibly complicated things.
Yeah.
You don't just leave a cleanup crew in there and let them do their job. You need to look after the cleanup crew.
Yeah.
So
But, unfortunately, it's become
yeah,
a thing where all it is chucking in some springtails and some moist spots and always bioactive. And it's like, that's not bioactive. That's nowhere near.
but to do bioactive right, you need to do substrate changes.
Yeah.
You need to constantly be adding new food. And the amount of people that seem to translate bioactive as stuff it in an enclosure for a year without changing anything, all that eventually happens is you just fill your bioactive setup with animal poop.
Yep.
But anyway, we're talking about nematodes. I'm getting distracted.
But
But yeah, I agree with you. Again, I think a lot of this um, really illustrates the issues we have as a community, in that we don't know, and perhaps we're not willing to educate ourselves or educate others or allow ourselves to be educated on the difference between these things. I think a lot of tarantula keepers go to big shows, they get really excited, but a lot of tarantula keepers are solitary people, and we perhaps don't have as I think a lot of the tarantula keeping community, but perhaps in some respects our community could be a bit stronger, where we could maybe have those conversations a bit more and maybe allow ourselves to be more educated about this. Because I think a lot of people are, because there was a post on the BTS where couldn't differentiate. This person was worried about fungus gnats, or worried about forest flies, and showed a picture of fungus gnats. I agree.
yeah, I mean, fungus gnats are tiny and they're just a nuisance thing. But you can put substrate in, you're probably going to get fungus gnats. And they annoy me, but that's about it. Forads, quite a lot bigger, about the same sort of size. Or when I see forads, they're normally about the same sort of size as a fruit fly, sort of thing. But they seem to have more of an arched sort of abdomen and stuff. Don't really fly necessarily all that much. They tend to kind of jump around. So I often see stuff. Tend to get them in tubs of crickets quite often. Sort of thing. So, but yeah, there's only a lot of confusion there. There's a good one from DK. Do parasites normally want to kill their hosts? Could an M be environmental that weaken the host and then allow nematodes to take over, like bearded dragons and their parasites?
I think you're displaying a very deep understanding or a very deep appreciation of how these things get a lot more complicated. Uh, it really depends on the parasite. I think many hosts have parasites. There's some, certainly in bearded dragons is a wonderful example. Think about pinworm. There's a lot of evidence looking at wild bearded dragons that pinworms is a variation of normal. So when we have an overgrowth of pinworms, is it because the pinworms are trying to kill the host? No, it's because something is causing that balance to be, essentially put out of kilter, which is why you have that issue. And again, do parasites normally want to kill the host? Ideally, parasites don't want to kill the host because then they can't keep parasitizing. Depending on the parasite's life cycle and its survival strategy, But this is kind of the issue. Some of these nematodes are not in their host, which is why they become so deadly. So some of these parasites are jumping hosts. So this is when you see it in captive collections, when you have a spider that suddenly develops nematodes, is because one of the other spiders has that nematode. It's managed to get over, and that's why the problem's there. So I guess also, I agree with you. Could it be that the environment weakens the host and allows nematodes to take over? I think a lot of these spiders, especially ones that are at a show, you know, we should be very careful not to demonize vendors, not to demonize traders. A lot of those people are really passionate about spiders themselves. Uh, but I think the whole process of going to the show is stressful. You are moved out of your enclosure into a small box, and then you are taken in a car, which is a vibrating thing, which we know in crickets causes a cortisol release. It is stressful to be vibrated for an invertebrate. They associate it with being attacked. Then they get plonked onto a table with millions of other species, which many of them can see. We could have a discussion about how good the eyesight of tarantulas are, but they certainly have some level of eyesight. If you certainly have pretty sophisticated ocelli, um, you know, they have 8 eyes. They could definitely have some appreciation of visual information, and yet they're on a table with millions of. These aren't naturally, uh, with some exceptions, Embafuri, H. gigas, some of the Popliteria species are a little bit more communal, but most aren't. So you're stuffing all of these animals that are solitary all together, and then someone's picking them up, looking at them, and then they're putting them back into a car, rumbling it, and then for another who knows how long, then they're getting reintroduced to a brand new environment, which may or may not be all right for them. If you've bought a mystery box, which I have mixed feelings about, you buy a mystery box, you don't necessarily know what that spider needs. You ideally have the stuff at home to deal with any spider if you're going to buy one of those boxes, but say you don't, you put the spider in an unideal enclosure. But I guess the point I make is there are stresses after stresses after stresses. And actually, for the most part, tarantulas tolerate those stresses really, really well. Certainly better than any vertebrate would. But are we potentially exposing the animal to enough stress that it could make them much more susceptible to that nematode infestation? Yeah, I think so. I don't know if that answers the question, DK Dragon Kingdom.
Like is it true that springtails eat mites and their eggs? As far as I'm
Yes.
mainly outcompete them, as far as I'm aware.
Yes and no. I think they outcompete them. I think the strategy of mites is to make millions of yourself and stuff yourself everywhere in the environment. That's how mites spread. So it may well be that springtails eat mites and their eggs. It may not necessarily matter that much because mites are designed to make thousands of themselves. If they start feeding, they'll produce thousands of themselves. So if you have mites in an environment, I don't think it necessarily matters if you have springtails because there may be sufficient numbers of mites that if you introduce another spider or the same spider to that environment, it's just going to get reinfested. So this is the reason why if you have mites, you should treat the mites on the tarantula and then you shouldn't put the spider back into the same enclosure. You should have a brand new enclosure which is sterilely clean and introduce it to that. Or you should introduce it to multiple changes of environment, i.e. lots of mini enclosures in a row, a day mini enclosure, a day mini enclosure, to try and reduce the numbers of mites there. Springtails aren't, I mean, they may buffer a little bit, but I don't think they're going to make that much of a difference, if you want me to be really honest, even if they do eat some of the mites of the eggs.
It's something that you always hear about like, oh, if you might just put loads of springtails in, it's all like, well, how about chuck out all the substrate and clean everything?
OC tarantulas is asked. Oh, I saw a lot of fish, silverfish inside the whole of a tarantula in the wild. I've been
Yeah,
watching for over 2 years now.
interesting one.
I think it's definitely true. I think it's definitely true. These animals live in. They have relationships with other animals in their ecosystems.
Osman Ozzy, yeah, was asked, yeah, can humans transmit nematodes?
Yes, very much so. We get nematodes just like any other animal. I guess more importantly is, can humans transmit nematodes to tarantulas? Maybe. Can tarantulas transmit nematodes to humans? That's also a maybe. So
And as well,
nematodes.
can we transmit, from tarantula to tarantula with us taking them in between?
I don't know. That's a very interesting question. I don't think it's ever been reported. I think it's possible. I think, okay, it depends on what you mean. I think tarantula giving nematodes to human, and then human giving nematodes to tarantula, i.e., human manages to get some tarantula feces into their mouth.
I
They
think
give.
where Osman's probably going with is, can we, like, say, like we're using like tongs or touch and substrate,
Yeah,
pass in between,
yeah.
like
I,
between
I
different
think
tarantulas?
I think you definitely could. It's spread via feces and via that bacterial soup. So anything that bacterial soup or feces has been exposed to, if you're mixing those tools with something else, bearing in mind that nematodes often are environmental, that's how they spread. I think if you're handling them with if you're handling a nematode, so let's put it this way: if I'm dealing with a nematode tarantula, it has its own tools, it has its own enclosure, and it often has its own room, even away from my other impatients. So, you know, these animals are my lives. Hence why I'm talking to you guys in the evening. I have my own tarantulas, which are my pet tarantulas, which my wife has domain over. They are very, very valued and they must be kept safe at all costs. Then I have tarantulas that I keep as inpatients, often research cases, uh, and they are kept in their own little inpatient hospital facility in my house. And then I have nematode quarantine infected tarantulas. So any of those potential nematode tarantulas get their own tools. Usually they're actually double enclosed in the quarantine. They are not allowed anywhere near, and I do not share. And if I those tools stay with those tarantulas until the tarantula is out of the collection or out of the quarantine back to its owner, or the tarantula is dead. They do not move. And anything that goes near the tarantula, so even prey, that tarantula has its own set of prey because I don't want any chance of me spreading it to something else. Uh, so we've got some discussion of best way to clean
Yeah,
tongs or equipment
yeah,
once
DK
quarantine spiders been
Professor
dealt
Rookie
with.
is very fast about, yeah,
Clean
best way to
solution
speak.
for equipment and closures, um, which is a really good thing. So DK Dragon Kingdom, Tarantula Key. So Naked Flame, Michael Taylor, Naked Flame, then hot soapy water. I personally wouldn't use hot soapy water. I'm not 100% sure about Naked Flame. Um, I would probably use concentrated F10 or potentially concentrated Anagene, like a disinfectant cleaner, and I would probably immerse for 10 minutes. So
F10 is easy
if
to
we
get
are,
hold of as well, which is
what was that?
F10 is really easy to get hold of from most sort
Yeah,
of reptile suppliers and stuff. It's a
yeah,
really good.
F10 antiseptic uh, immersion for 10 minutes. I think it depends on the sort of F10 you're using. I've certainly used F10 on invertebrates. I think if you're using the F10 wound decontaminator, that contains something called permethrin, which is not good for invertebrates at all. Um, but just basic F10, yeah, it's fine. As
What
is
about
safe for.
Safe 4? I was about to say, what about Safe 4? Because obviously we use that in zoos, or a lot of zoos use Safe 4.
Yeah. So I've certainly not had any issues with F10 with my invertebrates. I use either Anagene, high level disinfectant, F10, or Safe 4. I've used all three of those with minimal issue. If that helps you, DK Dragon Kingdom. But there is an F10 wound discontaminant spray, which is often used in reptiles and in rabbits, which is, I think it's designed for fly strike, uh, which I 100% would not use on invertebrates.
So
So,
there's
yes, that's it.
the
Uh,
Reptons there in
you
F10.
would have to, could you get me a
Oh, we've lost your sound.
self? So
Oh, you're back.
passionate. I muted myself, sorry. Could you get me an Amazon link or just get me an idea of what it is? Because I mean, I use F10 all the time as an exotic vet. I've used it on multiple invertebrate species, from phasmids to mantids to tarantulas to gastropods. I've not had any major issues, so that's probably what I would use. I would personally, again, I think it depends. I think it's not wrong to give it a quick spray with F10 between animals if you're using different prongs within your collection. I think it's probably important to have a quarantine and then have tools associated with that quarantine.
Yeah.
So just because you can clean them doesn't mean that that's the best thing to do. You probably shouldn't start using tools in one area and then going to another. Yeah, you're right. It's all about Tarantula says need to improve that habit. It's all about just having that. I think a lot of it's just buying just buy way too many tongs,
You can never have
and
enough. You can never have enough.
you can never have enough tongs, and just have enough enclosures. And if you're gonna get into this hobby, make sure you have a system which can allow you to have a quarantine area, and make sure you've got an idea of when you're going to use it. So really quarantine 3 months. Though we could have discussions, we could have long discussions, because I know in the zoo world we've discussed quarantining a spider until it's next molted, which
Yeah,
could be a year.
I mean, we was having that discussion not that long ago with
Yeah,
how long we should be quarantining invertebrates within zoos and stuff. And obviously, I mean,
yes,
some people say 30 days is enough, and you hear that often 30 days. But you're suggesting 3 months for tarantulas. I mean, tarantulas are long lived, so I think the longer the better. Kind of thing.
yeah,
And obviously with the zoos, you've got like the butterflies, and obviously the butterfly people we quarantine for that long, they'll be dead. Thing.
well,
But
again,
yeah,
we
some of
we
that's
need to
long lived.
understand what we mean by quarantine, though, because this is
Absolutely.
the problem. A quarantine. So really, what you're doing is you're separating it from your other collections. So a quarantine needs to be appropriate for the use of the collection. So if you've got a breeding collection and you need to have a male in, and you're leaving it for 3 months, the male might be dead by the
Yeah.
time. So how do you deal with that problem? Well, actually, what is a quarantine? You have a main collection of animals that are permanently within your collection, and if you're intending to breed one of them, well, it gets put into the quarantine area so it can be bred, and it stays in the quarantine area for those 3 months. So you've got to have a quarantine that's appropriate for the species and for the function of the collection. So, for your example, your butterfly situation, well, actually, that butterfly area, if you're going to quarantine them for 7 days so they can emerge, that area needs to be treated with respect to that quarantine function. And then you've got to think about your other invertebrates in your collection and have appropriate barriers in place and um, essentially appropriate health and safety and hygiene between those different areas to ensure that you don't have disease spread. So you get me going. I'm talking about biosecurity now. But do you see what I mean? It's about
it,
understanding what you want to achieve with your quarantine and then understanding how to use it.
no, yeah, I think that's the thing, and I think that's where sometimes for a lot of it kind of gets confusing and stuff. I'm not quite sure, and sometimes I think that a lot of people sometimes, to me, think that quarantine is just put it somewhere separate and that's it. Which that's very simple terms, but you need that the separate equipment that doesn't, like I said, doesn't come out of that room, doesn't go away from those animals or thing. Even like separate substrates that bag substrate just stays in that room, doesn't come out of that room, and the thing. Separate feeders, so the feeders aren't going to and from. And also, if something else something new comes in and goes into that quarantine, that all the quarantine starts all over again.
Yeah.
And you start from day one again, sort of things. So no matter how long that one that's already been in there, if you then put something new next to it, well, then quarantine starts from day one again.
Yeah. I think the other thing to say is you've got to have a clear direction of travel. So you have your main collection, and that's where everything should start, and then it should go outwards into a quarantine. So if anything's moving, it should be moving outwards, unless it's gone through quarantine. So I guess having that thought of direction of travel should apply for everything. So really, if you're using something in your main collection that goes into quarantine, it needs to be cleaned. The direction of travel should almost always be away from your main collection or from your primary collection that you're trying to keep quarantined. Sometimes that idea of direction, I think, can really help people to actually remember what they're doing, so they're not moving tools back and forth.
Yeah, that's it. And then on top of that, as well as sort of, obviously, yeah, quarantine. I think you need to have sort of good like service sort of, so you're not doing like the ones in quarantine and then going and doing the ones in your main collection. That quarantine is
Yeah,
always done either on a separate day or after everything else.
100%, 100%. And you should be when you're thinking about the quarantine, you should be thinking about levels of risks to those individual animals, and you should be trying to make a risk group. You should be trying to say, well, actually, these are the least risk, so I'm going to start with these. Because if you've got a quarantine area, you also have to think about quarantine within that, which is why, as Phil says, you should, whenever you introduce a new animal, the quarantine starts again because that animal can spread everything out. And you've got to think about your risk because actually, what are your riskiest animals? Those are the ones you want to avoid. You want to do last. You don't want to spread anything from that animal to the other animals. But you could talk about this for hours, couldn't you?
Oh,
You just
absolutely.
realise that farmers and zookeepers are very anal at times. They have to be.
Yeah, that absolutely have to be. I mean, you know, often at work, I'm wearing gloves for every single enclosure and changing gloves in between every enclosure and stuff so that I'm not putting things through this at the other or getting tongs for almost for everything and they go in a bath of disinfectant in between and stuff. There's all this sort of stuff that, again, just to try and halt, any risk of anything spreading and stuff. Um, and we do that, that's, the majority of good zoos within the UK do all that sort of stuff. The amount of disposable gloves go through on a reptile invert section, and mine's a fairly small one, is insane to to a lot of people. Even the director sometimes will be like, "How could you go through so many gloves?" It's like, "Oh, because I'm doing this." I'm literally trying not to touch anything. So, but that's something that we get in the private sector we don't always think about, and stuff. And then these things sometimes, yeah, do sort of crop up. So in terms of like setting up a quarantine area, um, zone design. I mean, you mentioned about double enclosures for like nematode cases and stuff. Is that just like a tank within a tank, or is it something more specific?
So I think if you're going to have a quarantine, it should ideally be in a different room.
Because this is something that's come up very recent. Well, for me, very recently, of putting tanks within butterfly mesh enclosures in another room and stuff.
So I guess there's ideal, and then there's practical, and then there's pragmatic. And I think it also depends on what you're quarantining for. Are you quarantining for all things in all dimensions? Are you quarantining for bacteria or viruses, or are you quarantining for parasites specifically? If you're quarantining for parasites, say it's nematodes, you need to be in a situation where you can't spread nematodes from one enclosure, from one area to another area. So you need some form of barrier to prevent that. So it's typically oral discharge, fecal discharge. So you don't want any sharing of any substrate. Um, I think if you've got butterfly mesh and you've potentially got invertebrates that are going through that butterfly mesh, that could potentially be an issue. I personally, if it were me, I'd be very careful. Say I set up a butterfly mesh enclosure in the same room as my main collection, and I have my quarantine animals in there. If that's what you're sort of suggesting, I don't think that would be a sufficient level of separation for me to be comfortable. Um, let me just read this through. If you bring more in and place them in a different mesh enclosure, does the whole room need to restart? I probably would say yes. Uh, so the way that I set it up at home is one room is the main collection. It is on a different floor to the inpatients. The inpatients are in a corner, so there's at least a room away, uh, and then the really nematode infectious cases are kept another room away again. So you've got a big physical barrier. They all have different separate disinfections, and if I would start with my main collection. If I was to do it all on the same day, which I typically don't, to be honest, it still says start with my main collection, then I would fully clean myself up. I would do everything I need to. I'd disinfect everything, and then I would deal with the inpatients, starting from lowest risk to highest risk. So I start with low risk animals, then I go to the high risk ones. Then I would go out again and completely clean myself up, and then I would deal with any of the infectious cases. And I would be wearing gloves between. I guess the other thing to say is really, if you want to make this easy, prep it all ready to go. So if you're feeding, have all of the locusts ready, just in little mini enclosures, ready to just pop them in. So you don't have to keep back and keep going back to the same thing. And have your spray bottle ready and what you're going to use to clean the stuff up, have that all ready. You get a bit guess whatever, but that's what I would do. When I'm using physical barriers, but to be honest, what I'm suggesting that what I do myself isn't ideal. Uh, so, for instance, recently I did have a potentially infectious case. It didn't even come into my house. I dealt with it out of practice. That is 10 minutes away. That I have to get in a car to go to. The chances of me spreading something from that animal to my inpatients or main collection is very, very low. So there are a whole, as Bill will tell you, in a zoo, they wouldn't deal with quarantine on the same site even. It would be a completely separate site, completely detached from the zoo. So there are whole levels of how much quarantine you want to do and how much quarantine is appropriate for what you're trying to achieve in your collection. And so I'm pontificating a little bit. Is this making sense?
Yeah, I think that's really well put. The whole the butterfly sort of mesh enclosure where that seems to have propped up with this recent sort of thing of nematodes and stuff, and people have been suggesting putting like the enclosure inside the butterfly net because that will prevent forward flies from transferring them and stuff. So I think a lot of people have never gone. I mean,
Oh,
again,
I
they're
see.
not expensive, but then some people, part of it, I'm going, oh yeah, I can stick that in the corner of my room in my own collection, and they're in quarantine. It's all like, well, yeah, I'd want them out the room.
No, I wouldn't want them in the room. That would not make my wife happy. If I tried to do that with a nematode spider, I would have something thrown at me. Hard, I suspect. Hard and spiky. Forest flies are very good at getting into places, and most of these mesh enclosures have zips. So all you
Yep.
need is for that zip to be a tiny bit open, and suddenly it's a really not a very good enclosure. So, and again, assuming forest flies are not more part of the symptom than they are part of the cause, I think forest flies probably do spread nematodes, but I think it's more because they are attracted to
They're
these
just going
different sweet
between different things.
secretions rather than they are the source. I love the idea of teeny face masks for tarantulas, but the only way it would work is if you plopped it over the epistosperma.
Yeah,
You
that's
couldn't
it.
put it over the face because that wouldn't achieve. Well, I suppose for nematodes it might achieve something, but if it's for respiratory disease, you have to stuff it over the bug lungs, wouldn't you?
Really like a pair of jeans for it. But like, if that old meme of like, if you were to stick him in a pair of jeans, how would you do it? Transfer has asked that he's got two in quarantine in different rooms in basic setups in butterfly nets, which are only slightly larger than the enclosures. Tongs and tools and thermometers are in butterfly nets.
Yeah, I think that's appropriate. I think that sounds like a reasonable, pragmatic solution and quarantine. Different rooms. So you've essentially got two different quarantines for two different animals, and you know you, you have strategies in place. I guess the only thing missing is probably some form of disinfection before you handle them. So probably disinfect them
Yeah,
or disinfect
generally,
yourself
but
before.
get some
I'm
some safe.
assuming you're doing that. I'm assuming you're doing that anyway. But I think that sounds really reasonable. Again, the other thing is you've got to think about what is practical and pragmatically possible in your situation. If you are in a one-bedroom house, in a one-bedroom flat, that's a studio apartment, I think you've got to try and do what's best for that situation, which might be that your quarantine area is on one side of the apartment and your main collection is on the other side of the apartment. If you've got a 10-bedroom house, and you live in a mansion with five outbuildings, then you have the capacity to achieve greater levels of quarantine. So it's really about trying to achieve the maximum, quarantine for the situation you have.
Uh,
And it's
Hey Alice, she's just joined us, but she missed. Yeah, what's the recommended quarantine period? Which
I would say a good rule of thumb would be 3 months. It really depends on the problem you're trying to avoid with the quarantine. Uh, I think for nematodes, 3 months would seem reasonable to me. You could make an argument it should be longer, depending on really the problem you're trying to avoid. Viral disease, for instance, I think you could make the argument for 6 months very easily, or longer, or until the animal next molts. Um, it really depends on what you're trying to avoid. Bacterial disease, you could probably make the argument it should be a week. If it's not becoming septic and obviously septic, if it's not obviously dying within a week, you can make the argument. So it's really about what you're trying to avoid, I would say. But 3 months is a good rule of thumb.
when they're taking weekly photos and video, but he needs something clearer than a cricket tub, as every bit of dirt slash mites like storm mites and stuff have been on the tub and not on the spider.
Uh, I often, it depends on the size of the spider, but I often quite like agar plates. So they're plates that are used to grow bacteria, and you can get them empty. for pennies, and they actually make very good little mini enclosures sometimes. But they're very good if you've got a small, tiny spiderling. Because they're so clear that they work really well for taking pictures and videos. Uh, I think I've got a great video of a tarantula heartbeat somewhere through one of them, but those are quite good. Um, I don't like the cricket tubs. I think also just some good Tupperware can work quite well. Uh, you can sometimes use like a standard bit of Tupperware, and then you can use the agar plate lid to plonk on top, and it's clear enough you can take a good picture through it. If that helps, that's certainly what I do, and I have no issues. I mean, the other thing I do, I guess I have the option that if I really need to, I can anaesthetize the spider and take as many pictures as I like. Um, I guess I'm probably also a little bit brave. I sometimes put a spider in a. I use something called an isolator, which is, in the movies where you have those like that negative airspace thing that goes, and it has the little gloves in there, and you use it to handle
Oh,
toxic
yeah,
waste. I have one of those in my shed because I'm mad. Um, but actually, it means if I need to just take the tarantula out, I can just put it in the isolator. I can do my handling with it. It doesn't matter if it gets out of the tub because it's in an enclosed space that I can manipulate, which means I can take pictures with the spider just there because where's it going to go? It can go as much as it likes, but I can still manipulate what's inside it. But I'm mostly just gossiping about what I do with my life, really. Um,
He turns around and he just popped in and said that 3 months sounds like a very long time to him.
Longest lifespan of a tarantula is 42 years. Is 3 months really that long?
As for me, it's like
Uh,
for me that's quite short because in reptiles we often do at least 6 months
yeah,
kind of thing for a lot for reptile quarantine. We say sort of 6 months minimum, so 3 months, well that's half.
yeah. It's not that long. I know it feels like a long time, but it's not that long.
It feels about it, yeah.
You know,
It goes quite quickly.
I think it would be long, again, appropriate for the species. I think appropriate for what you're trying to avoid. It would be a very long time for a mantis, wouldn't it? Maybe most of the lifespan of the mantis. So a lot of it, I think, is having appropriate quarantine times for what you're trying to achieve. A classic example of this is live food. Now, you know, most zoos have this practical, you know, my recommendation in my chapter about tarantulas is live food for 7 days or for 3 to 7 days because there's no point quarantining live food and all the live food dies off and then you can't feed it to your animals. So
yeah,
it really it really depends on what you're trying to achieve with your quarantine period. So I'm rambling again.
no. So
There's a
yeah,
few really good questions that have come out.
he's only just sort of joined, but so he's asked, yeah, what was the life cycle of nematodes? But as you said, it sort of very much depends on species, doesn't it, as well?
Yeah, it's really dependent on species. So I'll give you some examples. I'll give you some really broad examples. Example one, the environmental life cycle as nematode is it gets exposed to the tarantula through the environment. It then multiplies in the tarantula, and then it excretes itself into the environment either via feces or via the oral cavity or oral discharge. That's life cycle one. So it goes back from the environment to the spider, then to the environment again. Life cycle two would be, prey. So nematode lives in prey. It then it then gets taken up by spider, it infects by spider. Spider then gives off nematodes into the environment, and then prey get exposed to that nematode. So that's another life cycle. So it really depends a lot on the species and a lot on what's going on ecologically with that animal. Bearing in mind we're talking about captive populations, but these are ecological, biological processes. these animals live in habitats and complex ecosystems, and these nematodes do as well. They're part of that story, really. So I guess what we're seeing when we see nematodes in captivity is us interfering with how that ecological life cycle works, and that's probably why we see very dramatic, though it is reported in the wild, very dramatic presentations.
So, as well, yeah, context for his quarantine, he bought a female Purians at Bedfordshire, heard issues surrounding the current situation, and he got from the vendor that people are saying that it all sort of stemmed from. Spider placed in quarantine. It's molted a week after, but he still wants to monitor for now to be safe.
Yeah, I think if you've got an animal or if you feel like you've got an animal from someone that has a known issue, again, quarantine, what is the reason for the quarantine? What is the intention? I think I'd be the same as you, even if it had molted. I think if I had an animal that was from a known collection of a known issue, the nature of your quarantine, and to be honest, perhaps the nature of your testing. So if we were to imagine you were a zoo, say for example you were a zoo and you were getting an animal from a collection with a known problem, and you want to avoid getting that problem in your own collection, you would insist on more testing, perhaps, or you would insist on a longer quarantine period before it could be transported. So I think that seems very, very reasonable, to be honest.
Whereas on
And
that, I mean,
probably,
is there any way that we can test for nematodes and tarantulas?
I think there is some. Again, this is where we start to hit on research and what we don't know. I think oral washes, so using saline or very dilute saline or Hartmann's to wash So, for example, if I saw a tarantula with this white discharge, the first thing I would do is I would put like basically get a little bit of fluid, put the fluid all around the mouth part, and take the fluid back, and then put that onto a slide and look. So essentially, you're taking that white soup, and I want to look at that white soup. That's what I would use to see if there are any nematodes there. The other thing I would look at is feces. So I would get a fecal sample, I would mount it. I'd either do a Berman's fecal flotation prep, or I would just mount it with some saline onto a slide and I would look. And that's what I would use initially to determine if there were anything like nematodes or parasites present. It's a good shout. It's exactly what has been recommended previously. I think uh, if you're trying to catch it early, that's probably what I would probably be trying to do. But in truth, the sensitivity for those tests is something we don't yet know in huge amounts of detail. It's not done enough. It's one of the reasons why I would like to be exposed and get more experience of nematode cases, because these things are probably things we need to learn collectively.
Yeah.
Because say you can do a fecal test on a tarantula when you can get feces, and it can give you a little bit more confidence that there aren't nematodes, that might be quite helpful. Um, and I've certainly had it before where I've seen a suspect nematode spider and I've not found nematodes. So not all of these spiders that look like they have nematodes have nematodes. It could just be that they have another parasite entirely. And there are lots of parasites that we do not know about. So the other situation is some of these animals, the parasite you're seeing might not be nematodes. It might just look like it. And until we actually do research and these cases get seen and get seen seriously, i.e., not just posting about it on the BTS Facebook and asking and then just leaving it there, until you actually try and figure out what the problem is and try and actually do the research, I think there's going to be a whole lot of stuff that we just don't know and never will know. Um,
As in, and then it becomes that vicious cycle that we
yeah,
see for years and years. Like, well, it's not like where people go, oh, my train or whatever, but it's got ill. Well, I can't really take it to the vet, can I? Because they're not going to know. It's like, well, if they don't, if we don't start taking things to vets or contacting our vets and be like, I've got this,
yeah.
what can be done, sort of thing, we will never know.
This is the thing. I mean, I know vets have a cost associated with them, but actually, vets do have the capacity to take this data and do something with it. If we're going to the right vet, a vet with that sort of interest, uh, most vets I find, most exotic vets will try their best with tarantulas. They'll normally call me, which I don't have any issue with. Uh, Actually, when all of us investors are trying to support each other to manage these cases and find solutions, because we're talking about nematodes. Nematodes are treatable in other animals. They are treatable because we have drugs that can treat them, and some of those drugs are uh, viable candidates for treatment in tarantulas. The cases just aren't being seen, which is it's a sad thing. But I think it's also something that our hobby has to sort of come to its own conclusions about. I mean, I did this very interesting survey on tarantula keepers, and one of the most interesting things was 93% of all tarantula keepers wanted more veterinary options for tarantulas. But I think it involves vets engaging with the hobby and the hobby engaging with vets. It's
Yeah,
definitely a two-way street. Like, I can go, oh, diddums, why can't I see all tarantulas in all dimensions? Actually, this is the reason why I do events like this. This is the reason why I go to the BTS lectures. This is why I speak at the BTS lectures. This is why I engage with this community, because I'm part of that community, and that's how we can progress these things. It requires a back and forth. It requires a conversation to make it happen.
that's it. Hey, Marina. I just want to say it's a great discussion so far. Zico says, fascinating, love it, and needs to steal your brains. Grows up, can they infect other invertebrate scorpions, for instance?
Yeah, they can. They've definitely been reported to scorpions before and centipedes.
So,
Whether they're the same nematodes that cause issues
yeah.
for ferrophosids, though, or whether they're that own species nematodes, I think some nematodes are very species-less. I got there before Phil got in there, and then you feel stupid. But uh, again, there's so many questions we don't know. I suspect some species can jump over, and some species can't.
But basically, yeah, I mean, pretty much anything can get infested with nematodes because they're everywhere. There's nematodes everywhere. Bajaran is asked, do the eggs nematodes stay dormant to wait for correct conditions?
I imagine they would, to be honest, but I actually don't know. I don't really know the answer to that question. I believe it really depends on the nematode strategy because I need to correct my life cycles. So nematodes get ingested. Nematodes lay eggs in animals. Eggs are hatch in animals and then get spread as nematodes. So nematodes, you have infectious nematodes, and then you have the adult nematodes that lay eggs, and then you have the eggs. The eggs aren't necessarily in the environment. The eggs are part of the life cycle that's in the animal. So I guess to answer your question, not really. I think the I think the infectious nematodes do probably remain dormant and wait for the correct conditions. So I'm correcting myself, but not really, because I think you're thinking of eggs, but actually the nematodes themselves may become dormant in the environment.
DK, have you treated tarantulas with forest flies infestation in the past, or is this a newer thing in the hobby?
I think this is something that's sort of I've personally not really treated that many tarantulas with forest flies. I would love to see more of those animals so I could. I think it's a newer thing in the hobby, yeah. I think there have been reports of maggots and these sorts of things before. It's by no means a new thing. Um, I'm literally going through my chapters with Invertivet Medicine is a great book,
There you go.
especially the chapter written by me, which is spiders. Because only a moron does it from memory. Checking is better than the best memory. Listen to me chapter.
There we go.
It's a good book, but yeah, other other maggots have been reported. So forage flies is a more new thing. Flies in general causing issues for spiders, and then maggots beating into spiders is really not a new thing. It's been reported multiple times before. If that answers the question, I suspect there are treatments for it. I think the initial treatment of we should really set up a fund and make sure we are sending specimens for testing and research. I agree. Yes. However, my caveat would be if we are sending specimens for testing and research, we should be very clear what we're testing them for, why, and what the end goals are. So, again, classic example of this is DKS, dyskinesia syndrome, which has been built up into something it kind of isn't. Uh, so, my conclusion, I'll tell you guys what DKS is right now. It's a sick spider. So, if we were to do a study on DKS, which would be really interesting, we would find lots of different reasons why spiders get sick. So which is what I've been doing privately. I I have found fungal diseases cause DKS. I have found that bacterial diseases cause DKS. I have found that exposure to antiparasitics causes DKS. I found that dehydration causes DKS. I found that nematodes causes DKS. I found that pretty much everything causes DKS because spiders are hydraulic, their gastric, their circulatory systems, and their gastric systems, also their gastrointestinal systems, run alongside the nervous systems. So, is it really any surprise that when a tarantula gets sick, it starts to exhibit these twittery movements? It's not surprising. It's actually their physiology you're seeing. So when we're thinking about researching these animals and thinking about testing, especially if we're thinking about people giving me funds to do research, I want to be really clear what we're achieving with that research because I think it's really important that people understand where their money is going rather than into nebulous things like invertebrate research. So I do think there is a place for perhaps the British Tarantula Society, for instance, hosting a project on parasites of tarantulas or ferrophosids and involving researchers like myself and other fantastic researchers like Stuart Longhorn and others, and actually having that hobbyist community be directed in the research, be very clear where it's going. So I'm thinking about accountability now because if you are somebody that's just lost a tarantula to nematodes, you're in a very emotively vulnerable state, and you might want to put £100 into nematode research because you desperately don't want that to happen again. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't be really clear what we're trying to achieve with our, our, our research because actually, certainly if someone's putting money into what I'm doing, I like to be very clear because actually a lot of the times I offer. So if you go on my website, you'll notice I offer histology for a lot of cases where I think it's 40 quid. Um, but even for that amount of money, which is incredibly good for histology, by the way, because it's essentially part funded, I charge that much because, to be fair, for histology, it really depends on the case. But if someone wants to pay me to look at their spider and figure out what went wrong, I don't want to charge nothing because then you would get everybody. I also don't want to charge very much because really I'm trying to figure all this stuff out. I don't have all the answers. But it's really important to be honest with money and honest with what you're achieving with that research. If that makes any sense. Sorry, I'm pontificating again. I'm good at
I think
pontificating.
that's really good. I think. Goes us. Where it seems like white discharge, etc., be seen in all animals that are infected.
No, it's end stage to the point that I actually discussed the use of endoscopy. So endoscopy is use of an endoscope, which is basically a camera. It's sort of a glass lens which we use to magnify, which is used to look in orifices And I will often recommend using that before, if you've got a suspect tarantula. Probably what they will initially start with is actually DKS signs or weakness or lethargy, you know, or writing issues, deficits in their posture.
I reckon it's where one of his Reduncus that
Yeah,
has some DKS,
I
but it's 3 times, eats weekly, just moves extremely weird compared to every spider he's seen.
yeah, I've got a few of these DKS cases. I've had a few long-term borders which I just DKS despite molting multiple times. I do think a few of them are geriatric. I do think some of them are just ancient spiders. And again, the other thing to bear in mind is they molt their exoskeletons. They don't necessarily molt their internal structures. So the DKS might be involved with something internal inside them. Um, or it's permanent nerve damage. I mean, I've got a DKS case which has been going on for more than a year. I think the spider's going to outlive all the other spiders that I've seen. It's fine. It eats. It doesn't eat very well. You have to feed it, but actually, it's it's doing okay. But then it goes to demonstrate spiders. These DKS cases. Have I frozen, by the way?
Yeah, you've just frozen, yep.
Oh no!
I can still hear you, but
If I stop my cam and start my cam again,
nope, it's still frozen.
it's not even a very attractive pose. So people can look at me looking very, deep and full. The point I make is the thing with DTS, because it's sick tarantula, uh, and it's essentially part neurological, part hydrostatic pressure. Yeah, you're going to get these variations of of what DKS is, because actually so think about a dog. Some dogs are sick forever. Some dogs are easily treated. Some dogs, once they have a disease, they exhibit the symptoms of that disease for the rest of their lives. I think this is why I think this is why we've got a lot of variation in these cases. And really, though the term DKS has its uses, it really we should just really be sort of calling them sick tarantulas because that's what they are.
Absolutely. Uh, we actually come up to 9:45. I'm aware of the time, but I DK just come up. So as actually just part of that, DK is a set of symptoms and not a condition itself, which it's
Yeah,
can be all sorts of things.
Exactly. It's a symptom, not a disease.
Okay. So I just thought, sort this sort of discussion with you, so you can sort of enjoy the rest of your evening. Just for people that go into shows, we've got Coventry sort of coming up in a few weeks' time. Me and my parents are hosting a little one ourselves and stuff. When people are, already buying online or whatever, getting their new spider, scorpion, whatever. And so you'd advise, obviously, very much quarantine everything that you get new, sort of thing, but also because you're not necessarily going to see these issues at the show when you're looking at the spider that you're thinking of buying. So, and for around sort of 3 months and stuff in a separate room. If cases sort of come up, they even need to sort of, depending on timescale, either back to the vendor or try and seek some form of help. They can contact you from through your website or go to their exotics vet and see what they say as well.
Yeah, I'm really keen to see more of these nematode cases because my suspicion is for some of these cases is that they're more treatable. Because I've certainly had some of these cases where I'm achieving resolutions, I'm achieving uh, successful management of the symptoms. So the more of these animals I see, and the more animals that invertebrate vets see, as we're mutually discussing it, the better we're going to get at treating, and the better we're going to get at detecting, and ultimately the better we're going to get at managing these cases. And really, that's something that will help us all manage these problems, especially when you consider that we want tarantulas to remain in captivity. We want tarantulas to do well in captivity. Part of that is actually beginning to really understand their diseases. Um, so I think we're actually slowly but surely getting there. This has been going on for a long, long time. So I'm keen to see them. I'm also keen to support other vets that want to see them. So if anybody does actually have a sick tarantula, you know, and you want to try and do something, so just contact me on my website or contact your local exotic vet and ask them to, if they want to get help, they can contact me, or I'm sure a lot of exotic vets are more than capable of seeing tarantulas, to be honest. I don't like my freeze. I wish it was better. Someone said I kind of look like I'm taking a dump, and I'm like, I can see it. You can totally see it. But that's the cosmic nature of the internet. It just does these things to you, doesn't it, guys?
That's when it decides to freeze, and it's never in the most flattering of poses. It's always in some weird
No, it
pose.
never is.
So yeah, Sarah. Unfortunately, yeah, Benjamin he's frozen. It's not your screen.
Oh, I'm just really good at staying still.
Oh, man, Mark has just said, well, he missed a question from earlier, but from what he was hearing, is it more the risk of transmission via same tools / other insects, soil reuse, rather than the nematode migrating?
Soil reuse is a really silly idea. Just don't do it. Just throw it in the compost. That's where it should be. I know, really, you should throw it in the bin, but I throw a lot of my soil into the compost. So I guess I'm exposing my captive invertebrate diseases to the wild invertebrates. Uh, tr- Risk of transition will be from same source. I think if you've got to be thinking about your food, so you should never. So I have a Valhalla for my collection, which is I take the food insects I use, I give them to my tarantulas. If they do not eat that food insect, it does not get put back into uh, the main source of food insects. It gets put into Valhalla. So I essentially have another enclosure for my fed insects, and if the tarantula doesn't feed it, I'm not feeding it to one of the other tarantulas. I either put it into a separate enclosure to get refed to that tarantula down the road, or it gets put into Valhalla and allowed to live its natural life, which I know sounds really weird, but actually it stops that feed invertebrate from potentially reintroducing disease to another tarantula. Because if you put it back in your tub where you've just exposed all of those feeders to whatever that tarantula has been exposed to, and then if you feed any of those feeders to another tarantula, you're potentially exposing that tarantula. You're potentially introducing a disease vector. So I think that is a risk of transmission. So I would say different tools. Be careful with what you're doing with prey. Soil use is a bad idea. Um, there's also a discussion about shelving and what the different, which is interesting. Thanks, Mods.
Services to
I assume
include
it's
shelving
Mods, or
equipment,
is it you?
down
Uh,
collection, movement of an nematode.
I think just make sure you're cleaning your shelving regularly with a disinfectant. I think if you've got reasonably small enclosures, it's not too difficult. Probably the best thing is actually metal. It's probably the most inhibitory thing for the movement of a nematode. So some form of steel. I think acrylic and glass. Glass is probably a close second. I think acrylic after that. I think wood is atrocious. It looks beautiful. It feels beautiful. I love wood, but it's probably not the best thing for any sort of parasite because it's just very organic, full of little crevices and difficult to clean. So probably metal glass. Metal is probably the best thing, followed by glass, followed by acrylic, followed by wood. I guess the advantages of a glass and acrylic is it's easily cleaned, which is a real big advantage because you can clean them quickly and effectively with a disinfectant spray.
Thing is asked, is steam cleaning any good?
I think it can be. I think certainly used synergistically with a form of disinfectant. I guess your issue is you're making things very hot. You probably have to be quite careful with how long you probably want to steam clean, uh, and then be careful of how long that surface is being allowed to remain hot. I personally would reach for a disinfectant first. So you've got to remember, DK Dragon Kingdom, that there's a reason why we don't steam clean in the NHS or in hospitals or in veterinary practices. We use chemical disinfectants with known activities against known pathogens. We do that because we know that it kills things off. And steam cleaning, I guess your issue is if you've got a very deeply uh, infested area, actually steam cleaning will kill some things, but actually if you've got a nice good biofilm there, it's not going to do good enough. So it's not a replacement for a good chemical disinfectant. I hope that answers the question, Dragon Kingdom. You've had lots of good questions throughout the entire stream, so I'm very proud of you. Thank you very much.
That's fantastic. Cool. Well, if no one else has any further questions, I'm sure people will probably be watching this back again and again, probably for probably takes a couple of watches to get everything in. But I think that's been brilliant because there's been a lot. A lot of people have been kind of scared and stuff over the past few weeks with the issue and stuff. But it's all stuff that we can avoid, and we can do things practically within our collections to protect our collections and stuff. And which I think is really, really important to sort of get across and stuff. And just that one of the good things that's come out of this is that people are becoming more aware that this can be an issue and can become an issue. You still there, Benjamin?
Yeah, I'm still there. I'll keep talking. So my random strange face. I think someone did mention diseases coming from wild caught individuals.
Oh yes, yep. Yep. Yeah, are these effects coming in from wild caught animals?
So, just to repeat something I said at the very beginning, there's going to be three sources of these diseases. One is wild caught animals, because wild caught animals are exposed to these parasites in the wild, in their natural habitats. Those are parasites that are used to those animals. Another source will be other captive animals where these diseases and parasites are more endemic, because we don't have the capacity to really treat them prophylactically because we're not aware of the diseases as well as we are invertebrates. And source number three will be wild animals, but not wild caught animals, i.e. native invertebrates in the environment, which we are exposed to. So they will be a source of pathogens potentially for these animals. So I hope that answers the question. I think you do see nematodes pop up. I mean, you see like a low level of nematodes pop up just regularly where you have the odd one. I've certainly had the odd one reported to me. It's usually a few times a year, and then you have like a situation like this where it's usually associated with a shipment that some poor trader has brought in, has not realised, or it's been missold to them, or they've just a shipment's come in and there are nematode tarantulas, and they get sold for whatever reason. Whether it's someone who's not aware or someone that is aware but doesn't care. It's usually more complicated, but you see this every couple of years where you have a shipment that's associated with nematodes, and then you have loads of reports of nematodes, and it sort of then disappears because all those nematode spiders usually die, and or the ones that don't die survive and get through it, and then it's all cleared from the hobby or that particular instances. So there is, I think there's probably a low level of nematodes across the entire hobbyist community that we just don't detect. And then we have these really dramatic, you know, dozens of cases reported in a very short space of time associated with usually a wild shipment. But I think, again, it really depends on, there's a lot we don't know about this. There's a lot of nematodes that are associated with other animals that switch from here to there. I think, again, when you're breeding tarantula rookie, you've got to be breeding for a reason. Uh, I think there's a lot to be said for keeping a main collection and keeping a breeding collection. So remember what I said earlier on about, a quarantine has to have a function and it has to have a strategy in place. So you don't just quarantine, you should quarantine anyway, but you should be thinking about what you're quarantining for. So if you're going to want to breed, keep each breeding pair, each breeding situation in its own quarantine, and that will protect your main collection. I think if you're breeding, if you're bringing in an animal to breed, think about the direction of travel. Your breeding animal needs to go outwards into your quarantine from your main collection. You do not bring a breeding animal into your collection because that's bringing things inward. So when you're quarantining, it's all about keeping things outward. So if you want to breed, you bring your female into your quarantine, and yes, you're risking your female, but you're keeping the rest of your animals in your main collection safe. You do your breeding event because those breeding animals are a risk factor because they are exposed to lots of collections really quickly. Uh, so you just need to make sure that you've configured your collection and you've configured your quarantine such that that animal can be bred, uh, and that then it remains in quarantine for a set amount of time. You know, there are times and there are places to really think about what you want to do with your collection and think about it. You may have two different collections. You may have a breeding collection of animals that you breed and another collection of animals that you don't. Because I do think breeding is important because breeding, you know, ultimately prevents us from being as dependent on wild caught individuals, which probably represents a risk factor in this hobby and also a conservational cost of this hobby. So if you are breeding, two or three tarantula species and you maintain those populations in culture, that can stop those animals from being caught from the wild. That can provide an ethical source of these animals and potentially provide a conservational Noah's Ark if those animals become threatened or extinct in the wild. So I think we should be breeding because I think, it's better to be breeding and providing a source of these animals than it is to not be breeding it and us relying on wild caught. So I do agree, but I mean, I, I, I think it is possible to breed and to avoid disease. I think it's just thinking very carefully about what you want to achieve. But I'm now pontificating more at your comment, Frank, Ricky. There we
So
go.
yeah, well,
Yeah,
yeah, we
I,
can live alongside tea and not be problematic until the tarantula is weak.
I believe that does happen. Yeah, I think that can happen. I think that's why they turn up in these wild caught because the tarantula probably had nematodes when it was caught in the wild, and it's being put in a little enclosure for a couple of weeks that's made it happen. And I think that's also probably a reason why you have some of these individuals that have not been a problem in a collection for a year or two, and then it does become a problem because it's probably become immunocompromised for whatever reason.
Sarah But yeah, thank you, Ben. Do you know if nematodes can affect jumping spiders, or do they just affect tarantulas?
So I suspect the nematodes we're currently seeing are pretty tarantula specific. I'm sure jumping spiders are capable of getting nematodes. Every species, there are lots of different invertebrate species with reported nematode parasites. So I'm sure jumping spiders would have the risk of getting them. I think your main jumping spiders that are going to be at risk will be the ones that are wild caught or ones that are exposed to wild animals. I'm sure it's possible.
Oh. Hey, Richard. How you doing, mate? Cheers for that.
Thank you, Tarantula Collective.
Got $5 onto the chat. Thanks, dude. How you doing over there? So this is it. And this is all important things for us. Just I mean, just in kind of goes through something. Yeah, there you go and enjoy the rest of the evening. Is if we're mindful of cleaning, certainly cleaning our tools, any feeding tools and stuff. Especially like in between feeds, it might make feeds take a bit longer and stuff. But a quick spray of disinfectant on our tongs, it's only going to help with our main collections. Don't reuse substrates between enclosures, as hopefully no one is anyway, and stuff. But certainly, not putting what you've had an LP on into a Balfouria enclosure, for instance. Don't do that kind of thing. So, when buying a new animal, putting into quarantine with trashes specifically, you were looking at your recommendations of sort of 3 months quarantine, which to some people might sound like a long time, but when the trash is they're all fairly long-lived animals, even the short-lived ones. That's not necessarily a long time. Where for breeding, they go into quarantine for that breeding purpose. So, I think all this stuff's all relatively simple that we can do that can really safeguard our collections on a wider basis.
Yeah, very, very good. I mean, I love the JG's comment as saying, just clean the tools you use, never recycle soil, never take uneaten food out of one enclosure and use it in another. Clean enclosures and you are good. I mean, it is true. Like, it's a very good summary of what we're talking about from a quarantine point of view. Like, a lot of it's, it's a little bit inconvenient, but actually a lot of it is common sense.
That's it. And as you said, for whatever animal, whether it be a spider, a tarantula, or a tree spider, or a scorpion, if you're going to feed it and it doesn't eat that food, if you take that out, don't just put it back into the main food tub to be given out to something else, which is something that probably a lot of people do and we never think about, but actually probably should think about and really should think about that. Yeah, you potentially then just infected all those feeders that, would go on to affect other things, and even, quarantining for a few days, 7 days, your live feed. So, much like reptiles, we always say don't just get your crickets in or your locusts or whatever and feed them straight out. It's always meant, we're also about cot loading them, but actually, quarantining them for a bit. That's when you're doing that kind of thing and making sure, visual checking those and make sure that they look okay and look healthy. And if you're not sure about those, don't use those.
That's fine. Can you still hear me? I'm trying to play around with my camera to make it work.
I can still hear you, yeah. And so I'm sure a lot of people are guilty of reusing live feeds. I'm sure a lot of people, if they're honest, have done it.
Oh, I'm back.
Or you're back, or well, sort of.
Sort of. Oh, I mirrored slightly, which is unusual. Yeah, I think everyone needs to instigate a Valhalla. That's just an example of my stupid sense of humour there.
That's a really good idea. Yeah, just keep them in another separate tub and just let them let them live their life. Just have some pet life feed.
I guess a way around it is Valhalla could be food for the quarantine. Potentially, still not ideal because you're then introducing things from your main collection to your quarantine.
Mm.
So I guess this is also the nature of doing things to a point where you're having to think about these things. You're having to accept you're potentially going to have to take on the costs of that. Going to set up a quarantine with a rubies turning up on Wednesday. A lot of it, again, a lot of it setting up quarantine appropriate for what's coming in.
Yep, that's it. Oh,
Okay, should we? Should we? I mean, I could talk for hours, to be honest,
yep,
Phil. I really,
yeah,
I really enjoy talking to people who own these animals because I own these animals, and there's been a lot of fear the last couple of weeks, and it's just nice to maybe just help people discern the wood from the trees and just not be scared because I think these problems happen. They've happened in other animals. They happen in other hoppies. They've happened in snakes. They've happened in birds. If we understand these problems, we can begin to manage them. So it's really nice to actually sort of help people feel a bit more confident in maybe trying to prevent this problem or manage this problem. Set up the individual Valhallas and reuse that feeder for the same tarantula. That's pretty much what I do. I call it Valhalla because it makes me feel better, but that's pretty much what I do. I have a little tiny little cricket tub for each locust. It does help that I currently have one tarantula that is in my main collection that my wife loves, but I do that for my impatiens. They get fed a tarantula and they get fed a locust, and if they don't eat that locust, it gets reused. Or if I use a different locust, it gets put back in the same one.
sure. Amy, what can do, you can basically start quarantine all over again if you sort of thing potentially if you run out of space, run out of quarantine space. Fancy trying to make.
So I guess the question would be, and this is a the problem is tarantulas are a bit like drugs, aren't they? You end up having one and then you want 1,000.
Definitely addictive.
And Amy, couldn't you say the response is, why did you acquire another tarantula when you don't have enough quarantine space to deal with a tarantula? So I guess your options would be if you've got two options. One option is to make more quarantine space, which may not be possible. One option is to take the least risk animal in your quarantine and introduce it to your main collection. So that's why it's important to have an idea of risk and start with the lowest collection, the lowest risk to the highest risk, because then your lowest risk is the one that's closest to the animal gets shoved essentially closer in to make space for this new animal. I mean, this does almost work very nicely with Mandy's question, which is I don't have space for multi-quarantine areas, so I think that my collection for the foreseeable future is otherwise. Uh, I think that's my collection for the foreseeable. Otherwise, I'm in perpetual quarantine. Okay, that's actually one of the challenges of having a collection. You know, if you're going to quarantine, you're going to instigate effective quarantine. You've got to accept it. It's going to slow down how many animals you can bring into your collection and the speed of that and how effectively you can do that. And you're going to be limited by your capacity to quarantine. And that's both a good and a bad thing. It's a bad thing because you may have really good reasons to bring animals into collection, i.e., breeding, i.e., because that's an important animal for you because it's part of you want to establish those animals in a new situation. The good thing though is it does restrict how many animals you can bring in, and actually, if you don't want to be acquiring thousands of animals, well, it maybe creates more question marks. It maybe makes you think more seriously about the animals you're bringing in. Perhaps with an idea that you're curating your collection more, and you're thinking about the function of your collection, especially when you're talking about things like breeding. If you're going to be trying to breed, have you got an animal in your collection that is a good breeding candidate? Do you know what I mean? It's sort of it maybe it makes you ask more questions about how you're going about doing a hobby. But these are all problems that other people have, and you think this is actually a relatively easy situation for a tarantula because they can be relatively easily quarantined. If you think this is dogs or cats, if you bring a new cat into your house, it's much more difficult to quarantine. It's a really challenging problem for snakes. So, sorry guys, I feel like I'm being slightly mean by going, then why did you bring it into a collection? But you see my point, don't you? I think it's really challenging. I think, Amy, your main option really is either you need to increase your quarantine or you need to take the least risk animal, or perhaps you need to think about those animals in your quarantine and go, well, actually, I don't want this animal is not for me, and pass it on to someone else. So another option is, do you know what? I don't want this particular tarantula in my quarantine. It's stayed in this quarantine for a reason. It has, it's got its issues. It's a high risk animal for a reason. Is there someone else that can put it into their quarantine? So that's another way of getting around it, I suppose. So I've given you three solutions. One option is make the quarantine bigger. One option is take an animal in your current quarantine and pass it on to someone else out of your collection, because that's one way of getting around the quarantine issue. And option two would be take the least risk animal and put that into your main collection.
I think DK just the problem is many of us have a problem.
Yeah, I'm with you. This is. I love my wife because she is a voice of reason. Else, I would have a lot more animals. To be honest, um, I guess it is actually really nice. So I pretty much have one snail and one tarantula and about 20 others. 20 others are all various variations of impatient. Uh, but it is nice to have fewer animals from having more animals because you can put more effort and time into those animals. I feel like you do a better job, as I feel like the problem is it's too easy to buy 100, but then you have to deal with actually feeding and managing 100. I think sometimes we've got to be honest with ourselves. Would we do a better job with 5 than we would with 100? Do you know what I mean? But then that's a problem we all have. And sometimes if that's your hobby and that's what you're interested in, I get it. If you're passionate about these animals, then of course you want to get to know new species. That's part of loving the animal and part of loving the hobby. But we all learn these things about ourselves, don't we? That's life a little bit. Getting a bit philosophical now at the end of the 2-hour conversation about nematodes.
But yeah, that is it. And it's all things that at least a lot more people are thinking about. Which I think is a good thing. I mean, like this whole issue, and I know even in the States, people are hearing about it because I know the Tarantula Cat done a little short about the situation going on. That people in the UK were having this issue to make people in the States aware that it could happen over there, kind of thing. And stuff. So I mean, really, really important. But yeah, taking up, basically. So I'm gonna kind of let you go, Benjamin. But thank you very, very much for agreeing to come on again. I think you're actually the only guest that's been on 3 times now. I think you're the only one that's been on 3 times.
Oh, I feel very privileged. Well, I'm a big fan of you, Phil. I think I've watched multiple of your streams. I always enjoy coming on. I always enjoy talking to the chat. So I'll be happy to come back on again. Hopefully, it will be under nicer circumstances, won't it? It won't be like, oh, so there's this brand new disease of tarantulas. Can you talk about it, please? Next time, let's not have too much doom and gloom.
Good stuff. But yeah, no, it's been absolutely excellent. Yeah, tarantulas, excellent dream. But now even more convinced. Won't know when to release his into general population.
We're sorry, Guantanamo. Guantanamo, I love it.
So we're incredible knowledge and insight you have, Benjamin. Thank you, Benjamin. Going to rewatch the hour that she missed now.
Thank you, Sarah.
A lot of people will be rewatching. So with that, I will end the stream. So thank you everyone for watching and joining. Thanks for all the questions, been absolutely fantastic. Thank you again, Benjamin, for joining. So from there, we'll see you all again later. Right. Good night, everyone.
Goodbye, everybody. Take care.
Bye.